14. The next morning, Catherine awoke sweating in her bed. She didn't know how she had managed to get back to her room, but she guessed that Sister Nora must have called upon Father Michael to take her back to her room once she had finished with her. It took Catherine a few moments to take in her surroundings, and the true horror of the events of the evening prior came flooding back to her. Overcome by the shock of it, her tears started to spill. She gingerly made her way from her bed to the murky mirror hanging on the adjacent wall. She had to stretch up on her tiptoes to see her reflection in the glass, but once her face came into view, she barely recognized the reflection staring back at her. Her hair was knotted and raggedy, and her scalp was red raw from the clumps of hair that Sister Nora had ripped from her. Her complexion was that of a ghost, pale and gaunt, and she looked almost ill. She inched her hand up to touch the side of her face, but recoiled only a few seconds later due to the intense pain she felt in her mouth when her hand touched her cheek. She leaned in closer to the mirror and forced herself to open her mouth to get a better look at the damage that had been done. The side of her tongue was swollen, and the cut was deep from the forceps. There was a gaping dark hole at the back of her gum, which was still bleeding from where her tooth once was. She was in disbelief, as if trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end. Despite the pain, she moved her tongue tentatively across the rest of her mouth to make sure Sister Nora hadn't destroyed anything else when she'd passed out. She sank down to the floor in despair and rested her head upon her knees. The floors were cold against her skin, but she would rather focus on that than the searing pain she could feel in her face. She knew from everything she had learnt that some orphans who had come up against the malicious nun weren't as lucky as she, to make it out of her office alive. Why had Sister Nora chosen to toy with her, rather than ending her life? If she was such a threat to her grand plan, why keep her around? It was difficult to feel relieved about being alive when she was stuck in the orphanage with this mad woman until she became 18. That is, if I survive to become 18, she thought. She felt like an animal trapped inside a cage with its predator. It may have been easier for her if Sister Nora had just ended everything there, but it was evident why she had chosen to torture her instead. Sister Nora didn't want to make things easier for Catherine. She wanted to make her every minute filled with terror and pain. It was all a game of power to her. Catherine closed her eyes and tried to take a deep breath, but as soon as her eyelids shut, all she could see was the crucifix hanging over her face. She forced herself to open her eyes and shook her head in a frenzy from side to side, trying to get rid of that haunting imagery from her mind. If this whole situation taught her anything, it was that Sister Nora wasn't fully human. Up until she came to the orphanage, she didn't even know of this woman, and she was certain that her family hadn't either. However, Sister Nora knew about a conversation that she had had privately with her mother, word for word, as if she had been there right next to them when it happened. She had even managed to mimic her mother's voice, a sound she herself hadn't heard in months. No human could know these things, or be able to mimic someone's voice so profoundly. It was clear that Sister Nora was being controlled by an inhuman entity that was giving her unexplainable power. Father Michael had said it was the devil, but he also said that evil lies within everyone. So maybe this was who Sister Nora really was. Perhaps she was the evil entity, and the crucifix was simply letting her true nature be shown. Catherine was both intrigued and terrified by the sheer incomprehensible force being projected from this mysterious crucifix into the vessel that was Sister Nora. What was she to do now? Sister Nora was right from the very start. She was stuck here. She had no one to check up on her well-being. Her friends had long since forgotten about her since her parents' funeral. They hadn't even called to see her before she was sent to the orphanage. She scoffed. Some friends they were, she said aloud. The way she saw it, she only had a few options at her disposal, but none of them were optimal. Katherine dragged herself up from the floor and paced the room as she weighed up her options. I could wait until everyone in the orphanage goes to bed for the night, pack my bag, and run away. I could leave all this horror behind me and start fresh somewhere, she muttered under her breath. But then what? Where would I go? Nobody will believe the extravagant tales of an orphan, especially when the story seems too far-fetched to be true. And who could blame them? If I wasn't living this nightmare myself, I wouldn't believe it either, if someone came crying to me with stories of the devil and a cursed crucifix. She raised her hands in frustration. She had no money and minimal prospects. She would be forced to wander the cold, disease-filled streets, picking pockets to survive, unless she was fortunate enough to catch a fever and pass away. Her other option was to go to a church and try to seek sanctuary there. But given Father Michael's deception, she was wary of trusting another supposed man of God. What if there was the same evil there? What if it followed her? What would happen if Sister Nora ended up finding her? The only other option was to remain in the orphanage with Sister Nora for 3 more years, until she could leave. If she kept quiet and minded her own business, then surely it would lessen the routine torture that Sister Nora directed at her. There were always new orphans arriving, and maybe in a few days a new arrival might become fixed in Sister Nora's sights. If she was no longer on her radar, if another orphan had done worse things than she had, then the tirade would have to stop. However, this idea didn't sit well with Katherine. Her chest tightened and her stomach twisted at the thought. To have another orphan in her exact position meant she would have to act oblivious, knowing that Sister Nora would be inflicting this insane torture on someone who could end up being a lot younger and more fragile than Katherine. If she were to do this, then she would be no better than Father Michael. She shook her head in defeat. I can't do that. These children have done nothing wrong. They don't deserve to be subjected to that, Katherine muttered as she walked over to the window and gazed out. She didn't want to become as spineless as he was, especially when some of the orphans were quite young and might not be strong enough to survive the unending abuse. But to not turn a blind eye meant that she would forever be subjecting herself to bouts of sadistic torture simply because Sister Nora can, and she felt like she deserved it. Katherine's mind was frazzled with the culmination of her opposing thoughts and emotions. She kept changing from feeling sorry for herself to being angry. She was livid with her parents. Had they not died, or had they put a solid plan in place in case they died prematurely, she wouldn't even be here. She hated that her parents had been so stuck in their own little passive world of tending to the farm and going ritually to Mass that they failed to prepare for any sort of future, a future which they were now destined to no longer have, one that they denied Katherine of. Through the tears cascading down her face, Katherine managed to laugh, not out of humor or relief, but out of sheer desperation of the situation. She had no choice. That was crystal clear. She had to stay here and try to survive as best she could. She didn't wish her pain and suffering to be projected on another orphan, but she had to put herself first and watch her own back. She would have to remain invisible and wouldn't try to make friends with anyone. If Sister Nora saw that she was getting too comfortable, she couldn't guarantee the safety of those around her. Instead, she would take on extra chores to help each day pass quicker, giving her something productive to focus on. rather than the hell and immense pain of every day. She would no longer go looking for answers. She knew everything she needed to know now, and if she were to ever get that itching feeling to go deeper with that knowledge or to expose the evil within the walls of the orphanage, well then, her sliced tongue and severed gum would act as a permanent reminder what would happen to her if she were to ever disobey the word of Sister Nora again. She needed to keep in her place. That was all that mattered now.